The rain had been falling for 3 days straight when Elizabeth Ashford first laid eyes on Blackwater Manor. Through the fogged window of her hired car, the estate loomed like a gothic fever dream, all sharp towers and blackened stone, perched on a cliff overlooking the churning Atlantic. Lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating the manor's countless windows, and for just a moment, she could have sworn she saw a figure watching from the highest turret. The driver refused to take her any further than the base of the long winding drive. He was a local man, weathered and gray, with eyes that had seen too many seasons in this forgotten corner of Maine. His hands trembled on the steering wheel as he gestured toward the manor, his face pale with a fear that transcended mere superstition. Elizabeth noticed the silver cross hanging from his rearview mirror, the way his fingers kept touching it like a talisman against evil. She paid him double his fee and stepped out into the storm. The wind immediately whipped her dark hair across her face, and the rain soaked through her coat within seconds. Behind her, the car's engine roared to life with desperate urgency, and the red taillights disappeared into the darkness with unseemly haste. She was alone. The walk up the drive felt interminable. Ancient oaks lined the path, their gnarled branches reaching toward her like skeletal fingers. Weeds had conquered the gravel long ago, and ivy consumed the stone walls that bordered the property. Everything spoke of abandonment, of a place forgotten by time and forsaken by the living. Yet Elizabeth pressed forward, driven by a compulsion she could not name. Her great-uncle Cornelius had been a mystery throughout her life. He had never visited, never called, never acknowledged her existence until 6 months ago when his letter arrived. The envelope had been yellowed with age, the wax seal bearing a crest she did not recognize, a raven clutching a bleeding rose. Inside, written in an elegant hand that seemed to belong to another century, was a simple message. The manor was hers, along with all its secrets. He apologized for the burden he was placing upon her shoulders, but insisted she was the only one who could bear it. The letter concluded with a warning that she had dismissed as the ravings of a senile old man. Now standing before the massive oak doors of Blackwater Manor, those words echoed in her mind with prophetic weight. The manor was even more imposing up close. 3 stories of dark granite rose before her, the architecture a mad blend of Victorian excess and something older, something that predated the New World entirely. Gargoyles leered from the corners of the roof, their stone faces worn by centuries of Atlantic storms. The windows were tall and narrow, like dead eyes staring into the night. And everywhere, carved into the stone, were symbols that made her skin crawl, occult sigils and arcane geometries that seemed to writhe in the corner of her vision. The door was unlocked. It swung open at her touch with a groan that sounded almost human. Beyond lay darkness so complete it seemed solid, a wall of shadow that the lightning could not penetrate. Elizabeth hesitated on the threshold, every instinct screaming at her to flee, to return to Boston and forget she had ever received that letter. But something stronger than fear compelled her forward. A hunger, perhaps, or destiny. She crossed the threshold. The interior of Blackwater Manor was a cathedral to decay. Dust lay thick on every surface, and cobwebs draped from the chandelier like funeral shrouds. The entrance hall was cavernous, with a grand staircase sweeping upward into darkness. Portraits lined the walls, dozens of them, depicting men and women clothing that spanned centuries. Their eyes followed her as she moved deeper into the house, as she could not shake the feeling that they were not merely paintings, but windows through which the dead observed the living. Her footsteps echoed on the marble floor, each sound magnified by the emptiness. The house smelled of mold and old wood, of secrets buried and time suspended. Yet beneath those expected scents was something else, something that made her heart race, the faint, sweet aroma of fresh blood. Elizabeth told herself it was her imagination, a trick of her nervous mind. She had always been prone to such fancies, ever since childhood when she had claimed to see things others could not. Her mother had called them daydreams. Her therapist had suggested a more clinical term. But Elizabeth had always known the truth, even if she had learned to keep silent about it. She saw the world as it truly was, stripped of the comfortable lies that allowed normal people to sleep at night. The manor seemed to breathe around her, its ancient timbers creaking and settling. She explored the ground floor, discovering room after room frozen in time. The library contained thousands of volumes, many in languages she did not recognize. The drawing room held furniture draped in white sheets, ghostly shapes in the candlelight she had found and lit. The dining hall featured a table that could seat 30, set with silver that had not tarnished despite the years. It was in this study that she found the first clue to the manor's true nature. The room was circular, situated in one of the towers, with windows on all sides offering a panoramic view of the storm-lashed estate. In the center stood a massive desk of black wood, and upon it rested a single book bound in leather that looked disturbingly like human skin. The title was embossed in gold, The Chronicles of House Blackwater. Elizabeth approached the book with trembling hands. The moment her fingers touched its cover, a shock ran through her body, electric and cold. Images flashed through her mind: blood and darkness, ecstasy and horror, centuries condensed into a single overwhelming moment. She gasped and pulled away, her heart hammering against her ribs, but curiosity overcame caution. She opened the book. The chronicle began in 1642 in a village in Transylvania whose name had been scratched out. It told of a nobleman named Lucian Blackwater who had been blessed or cursed. The text was ambiguous, with eternal life. He had not sought this gift. It had been thrust upon him by a woman whose beauty was matched only by her cruelty, a creature of the night who had taken him as her lover and transformed him against his will. Lucian had fled his homeland, pursued by those who would destroy him, and had eventually found refuge in the New World. Here, in this remote corner of Maine, he had built his manor. Here, he had lived for centuries, watching the world change around him while he remained unchanging. The chronicle detailed his struggles to maintain his humanity in the face of an insatiable hunger, his attempts to understand the nature of his curse, his search for others like himself. It spoke of the servants he had employed over the decades, loyal families who had served House Blackwater for generations, who had kept its secrets and provided for its master's needs. And it spoke of the price of immortality. Lucian had discovered that vampirism was not merely a physical transformation, but a spiritual one. With each passing year, the human soul grew thinner, worn away by the weight of eternal existence. Eventually, nothing remained but the hunger, pure and terrible. Those who could not find a way to anchor their humanity became monsters in truth, lost to bloodlust and madness. The chronicle was filled with accounts of such creatures, vampires who had devolved into little more than predators, and Lucian's efforts to either redeem or destroy them. The final entry was dated 6 months ago, written in the same elegant hand as the letter Elizabeth had received. Lucian wrote that he could feel his soul slipping away, that the hunger had begun to eclipse all other thoughts. He had held on for over 3 centuries, but his time was ending. He had made arrangements for his death and for the manor to pass to his last living relative. He begged her forgiveness for the burden he was placing upon her, but insisted that someone of his blood must take possession of Blackwater Manor. If the house fell into other hands, the protections he had woven into its foundations would fail, and the things he had bound within its walls would be free to walk the earth once more. Elizabeth closed the book, her mind reeling. This had to be fiction, an elaborate hoax or the delusions of a madman. Vampires did not exist. The rational part of her mind insisted upon this truth with desperate intensity. Yet another part of her, the part that had always seen beyond the veil of normalcy, recognized the chronicle as fact. The sound of footsteps on the floor above shattered her contemplation. They were slow and deliberate, the measured tread of someone who had all the time in the world. Elizabeth's blood turned to ice in her veins. She had explored the entire ground floor and had seen no evidence of any living person. The footsteps moved across the ceiling, heading toward the staircase. She should have run. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to flee into the storm, to put as much distance between herself and this cursed place as possible. but she found herself paralyzed, rooted to the spot by a fascination that bordered on compulsion. She watched the doorway to the study, waiting. The footsteps descended the stairs with agonizing slowness. Each creak of wood seemed to echo through eternity. Elizabeth became aware of her own breathing, harsh and rapid in the silence. Her hand moved to her throat in an instinctive gesture of protection. The figure that appeared in the doorway was not what she had expected. He was young, or appeared to be, no more than 30, with features that would have been beautiful if not for their unsettling perfection. His skin was pale as moonlight, his hair black as a raven's wing, his eyes the color of dark wine. He wore clothing from another era, a coat of deep crimson velvet, a shirt of white silk, breeches and boots that belonged in a museum. But it was his presence that struck her most forcefully, an aura of power and ancient knowledge that made the air around him seem to shimmer. He studied her with those wine-dark eyes, and Elizabeth felt herself laid bare beneath his gaze. It was as though he could see not just her body but her soul, every secret thought and hidden desire exposed to his scrutiny. She wanted to look away, but found herself incapable of breaking that hypnotic stare. When he finally moved, it was with unhuman grace. He crossed the room in a motion too fluid to be natural, and suddenly he was standing before her, close enough that she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the slight curve of his lips. He smelled of sandalwood and something darker, something that made her think of crypts and midnight ceremonies. His hand reached out, and she felt his fingers brush her cheek. They were cold, impossibly cold, like touching marble. Yet the sensation sent warmth flooding through her body, a heat that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with a hunger she had never acknowledged. Then he spoke, and his voice was like velvet wrapped around steel, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. He welcomed her to Blackwater Manor. He told her that he was Lucian, that he had been waiting for her, that everything had been prepared for her arrival. The words washed over her like a dark tide, and she felt herself drowning in them. He explained that the chronicle she had read was true, every word of it. He was indeed a vampire, had been for over 300 years. But he was not the monster that folklore depicted. He had retained his humanity through careful discipline and a strict code of ethics. He fed, yes, but only on those who consented, who came to him seeking the ecstasy that his bite could provide. He killed only when necessary, only to protect himself or others from the true monsters that walked the night. And now, he told her, his time was ending. He could feel the last vestiges of his humanity slipping away, the hunger growing too strong to control. He had arranged for his destruction, had prepared everything for his final death. But first, he needed her to understand the legacy she was inheriting. Blackwater Manor was more than just a house. It was a prison, a sanctuary, a fortress against the darkness. In the crypts beneath its foundations lay the bound forms of 13 vampires, creatures that had lost themselves to madness and bloodlust. Lucian had hunted them over the centuries, had captured them and brought them here to be sealed away until such time as a cure for their condition could be found. The manor itself had been constructed according to ancient principles, its very architecture designed to contain and suppress their dark power. As long as someone of Blackwater blood maintained ownership of the estate, the seals would hold. But if the house were sold or abandoned, if the bloodline ended, the seals would break, and 13 ancient predators would be free to terrorize the world. Elizabeth wanted to call him mad, to deny everything he was telling her. But she could feel the truth of his words resonating in her bones. The strange sensations she had experienced since entering the manor, the feeling of wrongness that permeated every stone, suddenly made terrible sense. She was standing atop a tomb filled with horrors, and the only thing keeping those horrors contained was the will of the man before her. Lucian continued his explanation, his voice never rising above that hypnotic whisper. He told her of the responsibilities that came with ownership of the manor, of the rituals that must be performed to maintain the seals, of the knowledge she would need to keep the prisoners secure. He had left detailed instructions in the library, centuries of accumulated wisdom about the nature of vampirism and how to combat it. and he had arranged for certain resources to be at her disposal. Accounts in banks around the world containing wealth accumulated over lifetimes, connections to organizations dedicated to keeping humanity safe from supernatural threats. But there was more. There was always more. Lucian revealed that Elizabeth was not simply his distant relative. She was his direct descendant, the great-granddaughter of his human daughter, born before his transformation. The Blackwater bloodline carried something unique, a quality that made them resistant to vampiric influence, that allowed them to perceive and interact with the supernatural world in ways normal humans could not. This was why he had chosen her, why he had spent years watching her from afar, ensuring she developed the strength of will necessary to bear this burden. And then came the choice. He could die tonight, could walk out into the dawn that was now less than an hour away, and let the sun reduce him to ash. His suffering would end, his long vigil would be over. But the manor would be hers, along with all its terrible secrets. She would spend the rest of her life as its guardian, maintaining the seals, watching over the prisoners, and living with the knowledge that 13 monsters slept beneath her feet. Or there was another option. A darker path. Lucian could transform her, could gift her with the same immortality that had been forced upon him. She would become like him, ageless and powerful, capable of protecting the manor for centuries to come. She would never have to worry about the bloodline ending, about the seals failing because there was no one left to maintain them. But the price would be her humanity, her soul. She would have to feed on blood, would have to fight the same battles Lucian had fought for 300 years, struggling to retain her moral compass in the face of an overwhelming hunger. The choice was hers. He would accept either decision. But she had to decide before dawn. Elizabeth's mind reeled. This was insane, all of it. She should walk away, should leave this madness behind and return to her normal life. But even as the thought formed, she knew it was impossible. She had seen too much, felt too much. The veil had been pulled back, and she could never unsee what lay beyond it. She looked at Lucian, really looked at him, and saw the weight of centuries in his eyes. She saw the loneliness, the weariness, the desperate hope that she would free him from his burden. And beneath that, she saw the hunger, barely restrained, a predator's instinct that yearned to be unleashed. She thought of the life she had left behind in Boston. Her small apartment, her job at the museum where she cataloged ancient artifacts, her carefully maintained distance from anything resembling genuine human connection. She had always felt like an outsider, someone who did not quite fit in the world of the living. Her visions and premonitions had isolated her, had made her strange to others. Perhaps this was why. Perhaps she had always been meant for this. The decision formed in her mind before she had consciously made it. She would accept the burden of the manor, but she would do it as a human, at least for now. If the time came when she felt herself failing, when she knew the seals would break without her continued guardianship, then she would reconsider the darker path. But not tonight. Tonight, she would hold on to her humanity. Lucian seemed to sense her decision without her speaking it. A smile touched his lips, sad and knowing. He told her he understood, that he had hoped she would make that choice. Then he moved to the desk and produced a small leather journal, a key, and a vial of dark liquid that she suspected was blood. These, he explained, were the essentials. The journal contained the immediate rituals she would need to perform. The key opened the door to the crypts where she should never go. And the blood was his own, to be used in the sealing ceremony that would need to be performed within 72 hours of his death. He guided her through the manor then, showing her the hidden chambers and secret passages, the protective wards carved into stone and wood, the weaknesses in the defenses that would need to be shored up. He took her to the kitchen where she found, impossibly, fresh food in the refrigerator and pantry, provisions that had been delivered by the loyal servants who still maintained the estate in secrecy. He showed her the master bedroom that would be hers, a vast chamber dominated by a 4-poster bed carved with protective symbols. And finally, as the sky began to lighten in the east, he took her to the roof. They stood atop the highest tower, looking out over the estate. The storm had passed, and the first rays of dawn painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The Atlantic stretched out before them, infinite and gray. Lucian stood at the edge of the tower, his face turned toward the rising sun. He spoke then of his human life, the one he had lost so long ago. He had been a scholar, a seeker of knowledge, fascinated by the mysteries of existence. That curiosity had been his downfall, had led him to the woman who made him what he was. But it had also been his salvation, giving him the intellectual discipline to resist the hunger's call. He hoped Elizabeth would find the same strength in her own nature. He told her not to mourn him. He had lived far longer than any human was meant to, had seen wonders and horrors in equal measure. He was tired, so unspeakably tired, and ready for rest. If there was an afterlife, if some scrap of his soul survived the transformation and subsequent destruction, then perhaps he would find peace. And if not, well, oblivion would be its own kind of mercy. The sun broke over the horizon. Lucian removed his coat and shirt, baring his pale skin to the growing light. He stood like a statue waiting. Elizabeth wanted to say something, to offer some comfort or gratitude, but her throat was tight with emotion. She simply watched as the man who had been immortal embraced his mortality. The sunlight touched him, and he began to burn. It was not the dramatic conflagration of Hollywood films. There were no screams, no theatrical dying. Instead, Lucian simply began to crumble, his flesh turning to ash that was caught by the morning breeze and scattered over the estate. He did not move, did not cry out. He simply stood, accepting his fate with quiet dignity. Within moments, nothing remained but a pile of fine gray dust and the clothes he had worn. Elizabeth fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face. She had known this man for only a few hours, and yet his passing felt like the loss of something profound. Perhaps it was because he represented the end of an era, the last of his kind. Or perhaps it was simply the weight of what she had inherited, the enormity of the responsibility that now rested on her shoulders. She remained on the roof as the sun climbed higher, trying to process everything that had happened. The rational part of her mind still insisted this must be a dream, a breakdown brought on by stress or grief. But the journal in her hands was real, as was the key that hung heavy in her pocket. And when she finally descended from the tower and explored the manor by daylight, she found evidence everywhere of the supernatural reality she had been thrust into. The following days passed in a blur of discovery and adaptation. Elizabeth threw herself into studying the materials Lucian had left behind, trying to understand the complex system of wards and seals that protected the manor. The library became her sanctuary, its thousands of volumes her education. She learned of the different types of vampires, from the newly turned who retained most of their humanity to the ancient ones who had become little more than bloodthirsty demons. She read accounts of the 13 prisoners in the crypts, their crimes and the circumstances of their capture. And she studied the rituals necessary to maintain the magical barriers that kept them contained. On the third day after Lucian's death, she performed the sealing ceremony. Following the instructions in his journal, she descended into the crypts for the first time. The passage was hidden behind a bookcase in the library, a stone stairway that spiraled down into darkness. She carried the vial of Lucian's blood and a ceremonial dagger, her heart pounding with terror. The crypt was vast, a subterranean cathedral carved from living rock. 13 stone sarcophagi lined the walls, each sealed with heavy chains and covered in carved sigils that glowed faintly in the darkness. The air was thick with an oppressive malevolence that made her skin crawl. She could feel the presence of the creatures within those stone tombs, their hunger and rage pressing against their prisons like a physical force. She moved from sarcophagus to sarcophagus, anointing each seal with Lucian's blood while reciting the ancient words he had taught her. The blood hissed and smoked where it touched the stone, and the sigils flared brighter. She felt resistance, felt the prisoners thrashing in their sleep, trying to break free. But the seals held, strengthened by the blood sacrifice and her words of binding. When the ritual was complete, Elizabeth fled back up the stairs, slamming and locking the entrance behind her. She collapsed in the library, shaking and nauseous. She had felt their minds touching hers in those moments, had glimpsed the depthless hunger and inhuman intelligence that lurked in those stone prisons. They were aware, even in their sealed sleep. They knew she was there, and they hated her with a passion that transcended mortal understanding. But the ritual had worked. The seals were renewed, would hold for another year before they needed to be reinforced again. She had met her first test as guardian of Blackwater Manor. The weeks that followed established a routine. Elizabeth made contact with the families that had served the Blackwater line for generations. Men and women who lived in the nearby town and who came to the manor under cover of darkness to deliver supplies and maintain the grounds. They were strange people, closed-mouthed and wary, but they accepted her as Lucian's heir without question. Through them, she learned more about the manor's history and its place in the hidden war between humanity and the darkness. She also began her research into vampirism itself, seeking to understand the nature of the curse and whether there might be a way to cure it. The library contained references to ancient texts, obscure alchemical formulas, and esoteric rituals that promised transformation or redemption. Elizabeth threw herself into this work with obsessive dedication, driven by a need to give meaning to her strange new existence. But isolation took its toll. The manor was vast and empty, filled with shadows that seemed to watch her every move. She slept poorly, plagued by nightmares of the things in the crypts breaking free, of blood and screaming and darkness overwhelming the world. During the day, she worked herself to exhaustion, studying and translating, performing the minor rituals that maintained the wards. At night, she wandered the corridors, unable to shake the feeling that she was being observed. It was on one such night, 3 months after her arrival at Blackwater Manor, that she heard the voice. She had been in the library, poring over a 14th century grimoire, when a whisper seemed to emanate from the very walls. It called her name, soft and seductive, promising secrets and power. Elizabeth froze, her blood running cold. She knew that voice, had felt its presence during the sealing ceremony. One of the prisoners was trying to reach her. The whisper continued, growing stronger. It spoke of loneliness and understanding, claimed that the creature calling to her knew what it was like to be set apart from humanity, to see the world as it truly was. It promised companionship, knowledge, and an end to her isolation. All she had to do was come down to the crypts just to talk. There was no danger. The seals would hold. It simply wanted conversation after so many years of silence. Elizabeth felt the pull of that voice like a physical force. Part of her wanted desperately to comply, to descend those stairs and stand before the sarcophagus from which the voice emanated. But she had studied Lucian's warnings carefully. This was how they worked, these ancient creatures. They wormed their way into your mind, exploiting loneliness and doubt, promising everything while plotting your destruction. To give in to that voice would be the first step toward becoming their thrall, toward ultimately freeing them from their prison. She fled the library and performed a warding ritual around herself, one designed to block mental influence. The voice faded, but she could still feel it at the edges of her consciousness, probing for weakness. Sleep was impossible that night. She sat in her room, clutching a silver cross that had belonged to Lucian, praying to gods she wasn't sure she believed in for the strength to resist. This was the reality of her new life. This was the burden she had accepted, and it was only beginning. Part 2, The Temptation. Winter descended upon Blackwater Manor with brutal intensity. Snow piled high against the walls, and ice coated the windows in fantastic patterns. The Atlantic churned gray and angry beneath skies the color of pewter. Elizabeth found herself more isolated than ever, the servants unable to reach the estate through the storms, the town cut off by impassable roads. She should have been terrified, trapped alone in that vast house with 13 monsters sleeping beneath her feet. But instead, she found a strange kind of peace in the solitude. The voice from the crypts had not returned after that first night. perhaps weakened by her warding rituals or simply biding its time. She fell into a rhythm of study and maintenance, her days filled with the arcane work of keeping the seals strong. It was during one of her explorations of the manor's many rooms that she discovered the portrait gallery. She had passed through it before, of course, but had never really examined the paintings that lined its walls. Now trapped inside by a blizzard that showed no signs of abating, she took the time to study them. The portraits depicted the history of House Blackwater, beginning with Lucian himself. The paintings showed him as he had been before his transformation, a young man with warm brown eyes and a scholar's thoughtful expression. Seeing him like this, so vital and human, brought tears to Elizabeth's eyes. She mourned the life he had lost, the centuries of loneliness he had endured. But it was another portrait that truly captured her attention. It showed a woman of extraordinary beauty, with pale skin and raven black hair, dressed in a gown of deep crimson. Her eyes were the color of dark wine, and her smile held secrets that made Elizabeth's heart race. The nameplate read simply, Morgana, 1640. This was her. This was the woman who had made Lucian what he was, the vampire who had transformed him against his will. Elizabeth studied the portrait for hours, trying to understand what she saw in those painted eyes. There was cruelty there, yes, and a predator's hunger. But there was also something else, a terrible loneliness, a yearning for connection that transcended the centuries. That night, Elizabeth dreamed of Morgana. In her dream, she walked through a dark forest, following the figure in crimson who always remained just out of reach. The trees were twisted and skeletal, their branches clawing at the sky. Blood dripped from their bark, pooling on the ground in viscous puddles. And always, just ahead, Morgana beckoned, her laughter echoing through the darkness. When Elizabeth woke, she found herself standing in the portrait gallery, her hand outstretched toward Morgana's painted face. She had no memory of leaving her bed, of walking through the dark corridors. The realization that she had been sleepwalking filled her with cold dread. Was this Morgana's doing? Was the ancient vampire reaching out across the centuries, using some residual connection to Lucian's blood that flowed in Elizabeth's veins? She performed stronger wards that morning, invoking protection she had been afraid to use before for fear of disturbing the balance of the manor's defenses. She burned sage and myrrh, drew circles of salt, recited prayers in Latin and older languages still. The house seemed to resist her efforts, the very walls groaning in protest. But she persisted, driven by a fear that went beyond the rational. Yet the dreams continued. Night after night, Elizabeth found herself in that dark forest, pursuing and pursued by the woman in crimson. Sometimes Morgana would turn to face her, and in those moments, Elizabeth felt a connection that was both exhilarating and terrifying. It was as though their souls recognized each other across the gulf of time and mortality, two beings inexplicably linked by fate and bloodline. During her waking hours, Elizabeth threw herself deeper into her research. She began to focus specifically on Morgana, trying to piece together the story of the vampire who had started it all. The library contained references to her scattered across centuries of documents. She had been old even when she encountered Lucian, already ancient by vampire standards. Her origins were shrouded in mystery, but some texts suggested she had been among the first of her kind, transformed in an age when gods still walked the earth. Morgana had been a collector of sorts, seeking out exceptional humans and transforming them into vampires. But her interest was not simply in creating spawn. She was searching for something, for someone who could be her equal, her companion through eternity. Most of her creations had disappointed her, either succumbing to madness or failing to develop the strength necessary to exist beside her. She had destroyed them without mercy, ash scattered to the winds, her search continuing unabated. But Lucian had been different. He had resisted her, had fought to maintain his humanity even as the transformation took hold. This had intrigued Morgana, had sparked something in her that might have been love if such creatures were capable of the emotion. She had tried to keep him, to bind him to her will, but Lucian had escaped. His flight had enraged her, and she had pursued him for decades before finally losing his trail. According to the chronicles, Morgana had never stopped searching. For centuries, she had hunted for her wayward creation, for the one vampire who had successfully defied her. The last confirmed sighting of her had been in 1850 in London, where she had slaughtered an entire household in her rage upon discovering they were not harboring Lucian. After that, she had vanished, and most scholars believe she had finally succumbed to the soul death that claimed all vampires eventually. But Elizabeth was not so certain. The dreams felt too real, too vivid to be mere phantoms of her subconscious. What if Morgana still existed? What if she had somehow learned of Lucian's death and was now turning her attention toward his heir? The thought filled Elizabeth with terror. If Morgana came to Blackwater Manor, if she attempted to claim Elizabeth as she had once claimed Lucian, there would be no escape. The wards that protected the house were designed to keep things in, not out. They would be useless against a vampire of Morgana's age and power. As winter deepened, Elizabeth's paranoia grew. She began to see signs of Morgana's influence everywhere. The way the shadows moved in the corner of her vision, the whispers that seemed to emanate from empty rooms, the sensation of being watched that grew stronger with each passing day. She knew she was losing herself to fear, that the isolation and stress were taking their toll on her sanity. But knowledge did not make the terror any less real. It was on the longest night of the year, the winter solstice, that everything changed. Elizabeth had prepared a special ritual for the occasion, a reinforcement of the manor's defenses that could only be performed when the veil between worlds was thinnest. She had gathered the necessary materials: candles made from human tallow, incense compounded of graveyard flowers, and a knife blessed by 3 different faiths. The ritual required her to visit each of the cardinal points of the manor and perform a specific invocation, binding the protective energies tighter. She began at midnight, starting in the North Tower. The ritual went smoothly, the words of power flowing from her lips with practiced ease. She felt the wards responding, growing stronger, their invisible threads weaving tighter around the estate. Encouraged, she moved to the East Wing, then the South Garden, performing the same ceremony at each location. But when she reached the West Tower, the final cardinal point, something was wrong. The air felt different here, charged with a malevolent energy that made her skin prickle. The candles she tried to light kept extinguishing themselves, despite the lack of wind. And when she began the invocation, the words seemed to stick in her throat, as though some force was actively preventing her from speaking them. Elizabeth pressed on, forcing the words out through sheer determination. But as she reached the climax of the ritual, a voice spoke from the darkness behind her. It was not the whisper from the crypts, the seductive call of one of the prisoners. This was different, older, more powerful, resonant with an authority that made her bones ache. The voice belonged to Morgana. She stepped from the shadows like a nightmare made flesh. The portrait had not done her justice. In person, she was devastating, beautiful in a way that transcended mortal aesthetics. Her skin was alabaster, perfect and unmarred, glowing faintly in the darkness. Her eyes were indeed the color of dark wine, but they held depths that no painting could capture: centuries of knowledge and hunger and terrible loneliness. She wore the same crimson gown from the portrait, or one identical to it, the fabric clinging to her form like a second skin. Her hair fell in midnight waves past her waist, and when she smiled, her fangs were white as pearl and sharp as needles. Elizabeth wanted to run, to scream, to do anything but stand frozen before this apex predator. But she found herself immobilized, not by supernatural compulsion, but by sheer presence. Morgana radiated power the way the sun radiated light, and to be in her presence was to feel small and insignificant, a candle flame before an inferno. Morgana circled her slowly, appraising her with those ancient eyes. She spoke of Lucian, of how she had felt his death across the vast distance that separated them, how the severing of their bond had been like losing a piece of her soul. She had come to claim what remained of him, to take possession of his legacy and his line. Elizabeth, as his descendant, belonged to her now. Elizabeth found her voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. She tried to refuse, to assert her independence and humanity, but Morgana simply laughed, a sound like breaking glass. She explained that Elizabeth had no choice in the matter, that the bond between creator and creation extended to bloodlines, that Lucian's descendants were hers by right. And then Morgana made her offer. She could transform Elizabeth tonight, could make her immortal and powerful beyond imagining. Elizabeth would become her companion, her student, her equal through eternity. Together, they would walk the endless night, free from the petty concerns of mortal existence. Elizabeth would never again know loneliness or fear or the slow decay of aging. She would become something greater than human, something glorious and terrible. All she had to do was accept the gift Morgana offered. One bite, one exchange of blood, and Elizabeth would be reborn into darkness. The offer was tempting in ways Elizabeth had not anticipated. The loneliness of the past months had worn her down, had made her desperate for connection. And there was something in Morgana's eyes, beneath the predator's hunger, that called to her. A recognition, perhaps, or a promise of understanding that she had never found among her own kind. But Elizabeth thought of Lucian, of the burden he had carried for 3 centuries, of the struggle to maintain his humanity in the face of the hunger. She thought of his relief when dawn had finally claimed him, the peace that had settled over his features as he crumbled to ash. Was that the fate she wanted for herself? An eternity of struggling against her own nature, of fighting to retain the soul that made her human? She refused. Morgana's expression did not change, but something flickered in those wine-dark eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or respect. She asked Elizabeth if she understood what she was rejecting, if she grasped the magnitude of the gift being offered. Elizabeth said she did, that she had seen the price of immortality and found it too high. She would live and die as a human, would guard Blackwater Manor for however many years she had, and then pass the burden to another of the bloodline. The ancient vampire studied her for a long moment, and Elizabeth braced herself for violence. Morgana was powerful enough to force the transformation upon her, to make her a vampire whether she consented or not. But instead, Morgana simply smiled, a strange, sad expression that made her seem almost human. She told Elizabeth that she was very like Lucian, possessing the same stubborn nobility that had first attracted Morgana to him. That quality was rare among mortals, precious and beautiful. It seemed a shame to destroy it, though Morgana suspected that Elizabeth would eventually come to regret her choice. Immortality had a way of wearing down even the strongest resistance. Then Morgana made a different proposal. She would not force the transformation upon Elizabeth, would respect her decision to remain human. But neither would she simply disappear back into the night. She would remain at Blackwater Manor, taking up residence in the estate as its second guardian. This way, Elizabeth would not have to bear the burden alone. When Elizabeth finally died of natural causes, Morgana would continue to watch over the prisoners in the crypts, ensuring the seals never failed. And if Elizabeth ever changed her mind about the gift of immortality, Morgana would be there, ready to grant it. Elizabeth knew she should refuse this offer as well. Allowing Morgana to remain was dangerous, a constant temptation that would erode her resolve. But the prospect of continued isolation, of decades spent alone in this vast house with only the whispers from the crypts for company, was unbearable. Against her better judgment, against every warning Lucian had left in his chronicles, she agreed. Morgana moved into the manor that very night. She claimed the east wing for herself, a suite of rooms that had been sealed since Lucian's departure from the estate. Elizabeth helped her unpack trunks that seemed to appear from nowhere, filled with clothing and artifacts spanning centuries. They worked in silence, and strange domesticity settling over them like a warm blanket. When the work was done, Morgana produced a bottle of wine, vintage older than nations. They sat in the library, drinking and talking until dawn threatened. Morgana spoke of the centuries she had walked the earth, of civilizations that had risen and fallen, of art and beauty and the terrible emptiness at the heart of existence. She spoke without the predator's hunger, almost wistfully, like someone remembering a dream. And Elizabeth found herself responding, sharing her own thoughts and fears, speaking more openly than she had with anyone in years. There was something liberating about conversing with someone who existed outside the normal boundaries of human experience, who could understand the weight of the supernatural burden she carried. As the first light of dawn touched the windows, Morgana retired to her chambers, needing to escape the sun's deadly rays. Elizabeth remained in the library, exhausted and exhilarated in equal measure. She knew she had made a terrible mistake, had invited danger into her home. But she could not bring herself to regret it. For the first time since arriving at Blackwater Manor, she did not feel alone. The weeks that followed established a new routine. Morgana kept to her chambers during the day, while Elizabeth continued her studies and maintenance of the wards. But each evening, as darkness fell, the vampire would emerge, and they would spend the night in conversation. Morgana was an endless font of knowledge, having witnessed history firsthand. She tutored Elizabeth in the deeper mysteries of the occult, teaching her rituals and techniques that Lucian's books had only hinted at. Under Morgana's guidance, Elizabeth's power grew. She learned to perceive the invisible currents of magical energy that flowed through the manor, to manipulate them with increasing precision. The wards became stronger, more responsive to her will. She even ventured into the crypts again, this time with Morgana at her side, and performed a reinforcement ritual that would have been beyond her alone. The prisoners felt the change. Their mental assaults upon Elizabeth ceased, deterred by Morgana's overwhelming presence. They knew what she was, recognized the ancient power that dwelt in the East Wing. If Elizabeth had been the keeper of their prison before, now she was backed by one of the most powerful vampires ever to walk the earth. They retreated into sullen silence, conserving their strength. But Elizabeth was not blind to the danger of her situation. Morgana was manipulating her, she knew, grooming her for eventual transformation. Every lesson, every conversation, every moment of companionship was designed to erode her resistance, to make the prospect of immortality seem less terrible and more desirable. Morgana never pressured her directly, never renewed her offer. She simply existed, a constant reminder of what Elizabeth could become. And slowly, insidiously, Elizabeth found her perspective changing. The mortal world began to seem less important, its concerns trivial compared to the vast sweep of history Morgana described. Her human friendships, already strained by her isolation at the manor, withered entirely. The servants who maintained the estate looked at her differently now, with fear replacing the respectful distance they had shown before. They could sense the change in her, the way she was beginning to exist between worlds, no longer fully human but not yet transformed. It was during the spring equinox, 6 months after Morgana's arrival, that Elizabeth made a discovery that would change everything. She was cataloging a newly discovered cache of documents in the library, papers that had been sealed in a hidden compartment behind a false panel. Among them was Lucian's personal journal, distinct from the chronicle he had left for her to find. The journal detailed Lucian's time with Morgana, the months after his transformation when he had been her prisoner and pupil. It described the techniques she had used to try to bind him to her will, the psychological manipulation, and the promises of power. But it also revealed something more disturbing: Morgana's ultimate goal. She was not simply collecting companions or creating spawn. She was searching for a specific quality, a combination of strength and humanity that would allow her to perform a ritual of her own devising. This ritual would merge her consciousness with that of her chosen partner, creating a single being that possessed the power of both. In essence, Morgana sought to escape her own isolation by consuming another soul, becoming something new and unprecedented. Lucian had discovered this plan and fled before the ritual could be completed. But the journal suggested that Morgana had never abandoned her goal. She was patient, willing to wait centuries for the right opportunity. And now, Elizabeth realized with growing horror, she had found her new candidate. Everything made sense in light of this revelation. Morgana's interest in Elizabeth, her willingness to respect her choice to remain human, her patient cultivation of their relationship, it was all preparation. She was waiting for Elizabeth to lower her guard completely, to trust her absolutely. And when that moment came, she would attempt the ritual, would consume Elizabeth's soul and achieve the transformation she had sought for millennia. Elizabeth felt betrayed, but she also felt strangely understanding. She had seen the loneliness in Morgana's eyes, had felt the terrible isolation that came from being fundamentally different from all other beings. Part of her even sympathized with the vampire's goal, even as she recoiled from the implications. But she could not allow it to happen. She had to find a way to protect herself, to maintain the boundaries between herself and Morgana, while not revealing that she had discovered the truth. If Morgana knew she was aware of the plan, she might attempt the ritual prematurely, and Elizabeth was not certain she could resist the ancient vampire's power. She began her own manipulation then, a dangerous game of deception and hidden preparation. She continued to spend her evenings with Morgana, maintaining the facade of their growing friendship. But during the day, while Morgana slept, she worked in secret, crafting wards specifically designed to protect her soul from supernatural violation. She contacted scholars of the occult through coded correspondence, seeking any information about rituals of soul merging and how they might be countered. And she began to formulate a desperate plan. The ritual Morgana intended to perform required not just trust but a willing participant. The souls had to be open to each other, boundaries dissolved through mutual consent. If Elizabeth could maintain her mental defenses while appearing to lower them, she might be able to sabotage the ritual from within. It would be dangerous, potentially fatal, but it was the only option she could see. Summer came to Blackwater Manor, bringing warmth and light that seemed to mock the darkness of Elizabeth's situation. The Atlantic glittered in the sun, and wildflowers bloomed across the estate grounds. During the day, the manor seemed almost normal, a beautiful if eccentric house perched on the edge of the continent. But at night, it remained what it had always been, a prison holding back the darkness. Morgana seemed to sense that something had changed, though she gave no indication of what. She became more attentive to Elizabeth, more openly affectionate. Their conversations grew more intimate, touching on subjects Elizabeth had never discussed with anyone. Morgana spoke of her origins, of the ritual that had first transformed her from human to vampire, of the goddess who had cursed and blessed her in equal measure. And she spoke of loneliness, of what it meant to exist for centuries, watching everyone and everything you loved turn to dust, of the desperate hunger for connection that transcended mere physical needs, of the terrible realization that immortality without companionship was its own kind of death. Elizabeth listened, and despite everything, she felt her heart breaking for this ancient creature. Morgana was a monster, yes, a predator who had killed thousands over her long existence. But she was also a tragic figure, a being trapped by her own nature, seeking an escape that could only come through the violation of another soul. On the night of the summer solstice, Morgana finally made her move. She asked Elizabeth to join her in a ritual of bonding, a ceremony that would deepen their connection and allow them to share power more effectively. She spoke of it as a partnership, a voluntary merging that would benefit them both. Elizabeth would gain access to Morgana's accumulated knowledge and power, while Morgana would enjoy the vitality and perspective of Elizabeth's humanity. Elizabeth agreed, knowing this was the moment she had been preparing for. They gathered the necessary materials, rare herbs, precious stones, and most importantly, blood from both participants. Morgana drew the ritual circle in the library, a complex geometry that glowed with eldritch light. Candles burned at the cardinal points, their flames casting writhing shadows across the walls. They stood at the center of the circle, facing each other. Morgana began the incantation, words in a language so old that reality itself seemed to bend around them. Elizabeth felt the magic building, felt invisible tendrils reaching from Morgana toward her own soul. This was the moment of truth. She activated the wards she had secretly prepared, mental shields designed to protect the core of her being while allowing the ritual to proceed on the surface. It was like building a wall around her soul, hiding her true self behind a facade that Morgana could merge with. If it worked, the vampire would find herself bonded to an empty shell, while Elizabeth's consciousness remained free and protected. The ritual reached its crescendo. Elizabeth felt Morgana's presence flooding into her mind, ancient and powerful and terrifyingly vast. For a moment, she thought her defenses would fail, that the sheer weight of Morgana's consciousness would crush her wards and consume her entirely. But the protections held, strengthened by her will and the power she had cultivated over the past months. Morgana completed the incantation, and the ritual sealed. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Morgana's expression changed, confusion replacing the triumph that had been there a moment before. She could feel the bond, could sense the connection to Elizabeth, but it was wrong, incomplete. She was not merged with Elizabeth's consciousness, but rather tethered to it, able to perceive but not possess. The ancient vampire's eyes widened with understanding and rage. She realized she had been deceived, that Elizabeth had somehow subverted the ritual. But before she could react, Elizabeth triggered the second part of her plan, a banishment ritual she had woven into her defensive wards. The circle exploded with light, and Morgana was thrown backward, her connection to Elizabeth severed with violent force. She struck the library wall hard enough to crack the stone, then fell to the floor. For the first time since Elizabeth had met her, the vampire looked vulnerable, almost mortal. Elizabeth stood over her, trembling with exertion and fear. She had succeeded in protecting herself, but she had also made an enemy of one of the most powerful vampires in existence. Morgana would not forgive this betrayal, would not rest until she had exacted vengeance. But when Morgana finally looked up at her, there was no rage in those wine-dark eyes, only a terrible sadness and something that might have been respect. The ancient vampire pulled herself to her feet, brushing stone dust from her crimson gown. She acknowledged that Elizabeth had outplayed her, had proven herself stronger and more cunning than Morgana had anticipated. She was indeed like Lucian, possessing the same fierce independence and moral strength. Morgana admitted she had underestimated that strength, had allowed herself to believe that Elizabeth's loneliness would make her vulnerable. Then Morgana made an unexpected proposal. She would leave Blackwater Manor, would honor her original promise not to force the transformation upon Elizabeth. But she extracted a promise in return. If Elizabeth ever changed her mind, if she ever chose to embrace immortality willingly, she would come to Morgana. They would attempt the ritual of merging again, but this time with full knowledge and genuine consent. Elizabeth, exhausted and overwhelmed, agreed. She did not believe she would ever take Morgana up on the offer, but she was willing to promise anything to end the immediate danger. Morgana nodded, accepting her word, and began to gather her belongings from the east wing. As dawn approached, the ancient vampire stood at the manor's entrance, ready to depart into the fading night. She paused and turned back to Elizabeth, offering one final piece of wisdom. She warned her that the path Elizabeth had chosen, the life of a guardian maintaining these wards and watching over these prisoners, would destroy her slowly. The isolation and the constant exposure to the darkness would erode her humanity more surely than any transformation. In trying to preserve her soul, Elizabeth would lose it piece by piece, until nothing remained but duty and emptiness. Then Morgana was gone, vanishing into the pre-dawn darkness like a shadow dispersing before the sun. Elizabeth stood in the doorway, watching the eastern sky lighten, feeling the weight of solitude settle over her once more. She had won. She had protected herself from Morgana's manipulation and maintained her humanity. But the victory felt hollow, and Morgana's final warning echoed in her mind like a prophecy. Part 3. The descent years passed, and Blackwater Manor became Elizabeth's entire world. The seasons cycled through their eternal rhythm, the stark beauty of winter giving way to spring's rebirth, summer's warmth surrendering to autumn's decay, and always the return of winter's cold embrace. The Atlantic continued its endless assault on the cliffs, and the manor stood firm, a monument to isolation and duty. Elizabeth aged. Not dramatically, not in any way that would alarm a casual observer, but she could see the changes when she looked in the mirror. Fine lines around her eyes, a few strands of silver in her dark hair, a weariness in her expression that had nothing to do with physical fatigue. She was 35 now, still young by mortal standards, but she felt ancient in ways that transcended mere years. The work consumed her. The annual renewal of the seals became more difficult each time, as though the prisoners were growing stronger or she was growing weaker. The wards required constant maintenance, their invisible threads fraying at the edges despite her best efforts. She performed ritual after ritual, studied text after text, searching for ways to shore up the magical barriers that kept 13 ancient horrors contained. And always, there were the whispers. The prisoners had resumed their attempts to reach her after Morgana's departure. They were more subtle now, having learned from their earlier failures. Instead of obvious seduction or promises of power, they worked on her subconscious, planting dreams and doubts. They showed her visions of the life she had abandoned, the normal existence she might have had if she had never come to Blackwater Manor. They showed her growing old alone, dying without ever having truly lived, her sacrifice meaningless because there would be no one to continue her work. Elizabeth knew these were lies, manipulations designed to weaken her resolve. But knowing did not make them less effective. The isolation gnawed at her constantly, a low-grade ache that never quite faded. She had no friends, no family she maintained contact with, no life beyond these walls. The servants who brought supplies were polite but distant, made uneasy by the changes they saw in her. She had become something other, something that existed between worlds, and normal humans instinctively shied away. She tried to maintain connections to the outside world through books and internet, following news and trends, reminding herself that humanity still existed beyond the manor's boundaries, but it all seemed increasingly distant and irrelevant. What did political scandals or technological innovations matter when she spent her nights preventing apocalyptic horrors from being unleashed? On her 40th birthday, Elizabeth stood in the portrait gallery and stared at the painting of Lucian. She tried to remember what it had felt like to be normal, to have ambitions and desires that extended beyond mere survival. But those memories were fading, replaced by the accumulated weight of her guardianship. She spoke aloud to the portrait, asking if this was what he had wanted for her. Had he known what this life would do to her? Had he understood the price she would pay for accepting his burden? The painted eyes offered no answers, but she thought she saw sadness in them, and perhaps regret. It was later that same year that the first seal began to fail. Elizabeth noticed it during one of her regular inspections of the crypts. The symbols on the seventh sarcophagus, which held a creature named Constantine who had been imprisoned in 1789, were flickering instead of glowing steadily. She performed an emergency reinforcement, pouring her energy into the weakening ward, but it was like trying to patch a dam with her bare hands. The seal stabilized, but she knew it was only temporary. She threw herself into research with renewed desperation, searching for an explanation. What she found terrified her. The seals were designed to be maintained by a vampire, specifically by Lucian or one of his blood. A human could perform the rituals, yes, but only imperfectly. Over time, this imperfection would accumulate, and the seals would begin to fail one by one. Lucian had known this. The realization hit Elizabeth like a physical blow. He had known that a human guardian could only maintain the seals for a few decades at most. His plan had always required that his heir eventually transform, become like him, gain the power necessary to properly maintain the magical barriers. She had refused Morgana's gift, had clung to her humanity, and in doing so had doomed the very thing she was trying to protect. The prisoners would eventually escape, not through any fault of hers, but simply because she was not strong enough to hold them forever. The knowledge devastated her. Everything she had sacrificed, all the years of isolation and duty, had been for nothing. Unless she was willing to become a vampire, to embrace the transformation she had so vehemently rejected, the seals would fail and 13 ancient horrors would be free to terrorize the world. She stood in the library, Lucian's journal open before her, and wept for the first time in years. She wept for her lost life, for her fading humanity, for the impossible choice that had been forced upon her. And she wept for Lucian, who had carried this burden for centuries, who had known there was no good solution, only degrees of terrible necessity. In the weeks that followed, Elizabeth found herself returning again and again to Morgana's portrait. She would stand before it for hours, studying those painted features, remembering the vampire's final warning. Morgana had been right. The path of the human guardian was destroying her, eroding her soul as surely as any transformation would have done. She had become a ghost, haunting Blackwater Manor, neither fully alive nor peacefully dead. The whispers from the crypts grew louder, more insistent. They sensed her despair, her weakening resolve. They offered solutions, terrible bargains that would doom her soul, but solve the immediate crisis. She could release them, could let them go free in exchange for their promise to serve her, to protect her. Together, they could rule the night, could reshape the world according to their design. Elizabeth knew these were lies. The prisoners would never keep such a bargain. The moment they were free, they would slaughter her and rampage across the world, leaving rivers of blood in their wake. But the temptation was there nonetheless, a siren song promising an end to her suffering. It was on a gray November morning, exactly 5 years after Morgana's departure, that Elizabeth made her decision. She sat in the library, surrounded by centuries of accumulated knowledge, and accepted the truth she had been fighting against. There was only one solution, only one way to protect both the world and her own rapidly fragmenting sanity. She had to find Morgana and accept the transformation. The decision brought a strange kind of peace. Once made, it seemed inevitable, almost liberating. She had fought so hard to preserve her humanity, but what had that humanity gotten her? Loneliness, exhaustion, and the certain knowledge that she would fail in her duty without intervention. Better to embrace the darkness willingly than to let it consume her through despair. She began her preparations immediately. Finding Morgana would not be difficult. Vampires of her age and power left traces in the supernatural community, whispers and rumors that could be followed like a trail of breadcrumbs. Elizabeth had maintained her contacts with various occult scholars and researchers over the years, and she reached out to them now, seeking information on Morgana's whereabouts. The response came within days. Morgana had been sighted in Paris, holding court among the European vampire clans. An ancient queen returned to her throne. Elizabeth made arrangements to travel, to close up the manor temporarily and journey across the Atlantic. But before she could depart, disaster struck. The seal on Constantine's sarcophagus finally failed completely. Elizabeth felt it happen, a sharp pain in her chest as the magical barrier collapsed. She raced to the crypts, but she was too late. The stone lid of the sarcophagus had shattered, and Constantine was free. He was hideous, a monster in the truest sense. Centuries of imprisonment had warped him, had stripped away any vestige of humanity he might have once possessed. He was skeletal and pale, with elongated limbs and fingers like talons. His eyes burned with red fire, and when he opened his mouth, it seemed to unhinge like a snake's, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. Constantine lunged at Elizabeth with inhuman speed. She barely managed to avoid his attack, rolling aside as his claws tore through the space where she had been standing. She had brought weapons, of course a silver knife blessed by 3 different faiths, vials of holy water, wooden stakes carved with protective symbols. But they seemed pathetic against this ancient terror. The battle was brutal and desperate. Constantine was weakened by his long imprisonment, his body atrophied from centuries of magical sleep. But he was still far stronger and faster than any human, and his hunger was a palpable force that filled the crypt with malevolent energy. Elizabeth fought with everything she had, using every trick and technique she had learned over the years. She managed to wound him, driving the silver knife into his shoulder. Constantine screamed, a sound that echoed through the crypts and set the other prisoners thrashing in their stone tombs. But the wound only enraged him further. He grabbed Elizabeth by the throat and lifted her off the ground, his grip crushing, his breath reeking of decay and old blood. Elizabeth's vision began to darken at the edges. She could feel her life draining away, could feel death approaching with terrible certainty. In that moment, facing the abyss, she felt an unexpected calm. At least her suffering would end. At least she would be free. But then Constantine's head exploded in a spray of black ichor. Elizabeth fell to the ground, gasping for breath. Through her blurred vision, she saw a figure standing in the entrance to the crypts, arm outstretched, power radiating from her like heat from a furnace. Morgana had returned. The ancient vampire descended into the crypts like an avenging angel, her crimson gown swirling around her, her eyes blazing with fury. She tore through what remained of Constantine with casual brutality, reducing the ancient vampire to ash within seconds. Then she turned to the other sarcophagi, reinforcing their seals with a gesture, her power so vast that it made Elizabeth's careful rituals seem like child's play. When the immediate danger had passed, Morgana helped Elizabeth to her feet. The ancient vampire's expression was unreadable, but there was something like concern in her eyes. She had sensed the seal's failure from across the ocean, had felt the moment when Constantine broke free, and had traveled at supernatural speed to prevent catastrophe. They ascended from the crypts together, Elizabeth leaning heavily on Morgana's arm. In the library, Morgana examined Elizabeth's wounds, which were severe but not fatal. The vampire's touch was gentle, almost tender, as she cleaned and bandaged the injuries. And for the first time since Morgana's departure, they truly talked. Elizabeth admitted everything. The failing seals, the slow erosion of her sanity, the decision to seek Morgana out and accept transformation. She laid bare her despair and her resignation, holding nothing back. Morgana listened without interruption, her ancient eyes reflecting something that might have been compassion. When Elizabeth finished, Morgana was silent for a long moment. Then she revealed a truth that changed everything. She had known about the failing seals, had felt them weakening from afar. She had stayed away deliberately, waiting to see what Elizabeth would choose when faced with the inevitable. It had been a test, perhaps a cruel one, but Morgana needed to know if Elizabeth would choose transformation out of desperation or genuine desire. The ancient vampire explained that the ritual of merging she had attempted years ago had been flawed, driven by her own loneliness and need rather than true compatibility. She had realized this in the years since, had come to understand that such a union could not be forced or manipulated. It required absolute honesty, complete trust, and mutual desire. Without these elements, the ritual would only create an abomination, a twisted fusion that satisfied no one. But now Morgana believed they had reached the point where such a union might be possible. Elizabeth was choosing transformation with full knowledge of its implications, not as a victim but as a willing participant. And Morgana had learned patience, had shed some of her desperate need for connection, in favor of genuine care for this remarkable mortal who had defied her so effectively. She made Elizabeth an offer, different from any she had proposed before. She would transform Elizabeth into a vampire, yes, but slowly, over the course of months. The traditional transformation was violent and traumatic, a single night of agony that left the newly turned disoriented and overwhelmed. But there were older methods, rituals that allowed for a gradual transition, letting the new vampire acclimate to each stage of the change before proceeding to the next. This method would give Elizabeth time to adjust, to learn control before the full weight of the hunger descended upon her. And it would allow them to build the trust necessary for the eventual merging ritual, should they both still desire it after the transformation was complete. Elizabeth accepted, not with joy or relief, but with a quiet resignation that had in it a seed of something else, perhaps hope, perhaps curiosity about what she might become. She had fought so hard to preserve her humanity, But humanity was what had failed her. Perhaps it was time to become something else, something stronger, something capable of bearing the burden that had been placed upon her. The transformation began that very night. Morgana performed the first ritual, a ceremony that involved the exchange of a small amount of blood and the invocation of ancient powers. Elizabeth felt the vampire essence entering her system, cold and electric, beginning the slow process of rewriting her very nature at a cellular level. The changes were subtle at first. A slight enhancement of her senses, a small increase in her strength and speed. Her wounds from the battle with Constantine healed with unnatural rapidity, and she found she needed less sleep than before. But the most profound change was internal. She could feel the beginning of the hunger, a low whisper in the back of her mind, patient and implacable. Morgana guided her through these early stages with expertise born of millennia. She taught Elizabeth how to manage the hunger, how to feed without killing, how to select willing donors and erase their memories afterward. She showed her the full breadth of vampiric abilities, from supernatural strength and speed to the more esoteric powers of mental influence and shadow manipulation. And slowly, Elizabeth began to understand what she was becoming. Vampirism was not simply a disease or a curse, though it certainly had elements of both. It was a transformation into something genuinely other, a state of being that transcended the human condition in both positive and negative ways. She was becoming a predator, yes, but also something magnificent and terrible, a creature of the night with capabilities that would have seemed like magic to her former self. The transformation proceeded in stages over the course of 6 months. Each ritual brought her closer to full vampirism, and each stage required her to adapt to new abilities and intensified urges. Morgana was patient, never rushing the process, allowing Elizabeth to maintain her sense of self even as that self underwent fundamental changes. They grew closer during this time, developing a connection that went beyond teacher and student. They talked for hours about existence and meaning, about the nature of consciousness and the illusion of linear time. Morgana shared stories from her vast history, tales of empires and revolutions, of beauty and atrocity witnessed across millennia. And Elizabeth shared her own experiences, her mortal perspective providing Morgana with insights she had long forgotten. The other prisoners in the crypts sensed the change. They redoubled their efforts to reach Elizabeth, trying to corrupt the transformation, to twist her into something monstrous that might free them. But Morgana's presence warded off their influence, and Elizabeth's own strength proved greater than they had anticipated. She resisted their whispers, maintained her moral center even as her nature shifted from human to vampire. On the night of the final transformation, 6 months after it had begun, Elizabeth and Morgana performed the ultimate ritual. It took place in the highest tower of Blackwater Manor, under a full moon that painted the Atlantic silver. Elizabeth drank deeply from Morgana's wrist, taking in the ancient blood that would complete her transformation. And as she drank, she felt the last of her humanity slip away, replaced by something vast and cold and infinitely powerful. When it was done, Elizabeth stood reborn. Her senses were overwhelmed by the richness of the world around her. She could hear the heartbeat of every living thing for miles, could smell the subtle gradations of scent on the wind, could see in perfect clarity despite the darkness. Her strength was such that she felt she could tear the manor apart with her bare hands if she chose. And the hunger, which had been a whisper before, was now a roaring demand that filled her entire being. But she controlled it. With Morgana's guidance and her own formidable will, she mastered the hunger, bent it to her purpose rather than being consumed by it. She had become a vampire, but she had not lost herself in the process. She was still Elizabeth, still the guardian of Blackwater Manor, but now she possessed the power necessary to fulfill that role properly. Her first act as a full vampire was to descend into the crypts and renew all 13 seals. The ritual that had once exhausted her now felt effortless, her vampiric power flowing into the wards and making them stronger than they had been in decades. The prisoners felt the change and retreated into sullen silence, knowing that they now faced a guardian who was their equal in power and their superior in determination. Elizabeth emerged from the crypts, transformed in more ways than one. She had accepted her nature, had embraced the darkness she had fought against for so long. But she had not surrendered to it. She remained committed to her duty, to protecting humanity from the horrors that sought to prey upon it. Morgana watched her with pride and something deeper, something that transcended mere satisfaction. Elizabeth had succeeded where so many others had failed, had made the transformation while retaining her essential self. She was glorious, a vampire of tremendous potential, and Morgana felt a connection to her that went beyond anything she had experienced in her long existence. But the question of the merging ritual remained. Now that Elizabeth had completed her transformation, now that she existed as Morgana's equal, would she consent to the deeper union that Morgana still desired? Or would she choose to remain separate, two powerful beings allied, but ultimately alone? The answer came on a quiet night 3 months after Elizabeth's transformation. They stood together on the roof of the manor, looking out at the stars that wheeled overhead in their eternal dance. Elizabeth spoke of her experience as a vampire, of the strange joy she had found in her new existence despite its demands. She had not expected to feel liberated by the transformation, but she did. The weight of mortality, the constant awareness of death's approach, had been lifted. She had time now, centuries potentially, to explore and learn and grow. But she also spoke of loneliness. The transformation had solved many problems, but it had not addressed the fundamental isolation that came with being what they were. They were apex predators, creatures set apart from normal existence, and that separation carried its own kind of suffering. Elizabeth proposed that they attempt the merging ritual again, but on different terms. Not a consumption of one soul by another, but a true union, a blending that would create something new while preserving the essential nature of both. It would require absolute trust and vulnerability, a willingness to open themselves completely to each other without fear or reservation. Morgana agreed, though Elizabeth could see the fear in her ancient eyes. The vampire had existed for millennia, had built walls around her soul to protect herself from the pain of loss and loneliness. To tear down those walls, to allow another being complete access to her innermost self, was terrifying even for one as powerful as she. They prepared for the ritual over the following weeks, crafting the necessary wards and gathering the required materials. But the most important preparation was emotional and psychological. They spent long hours in conversation, sharing their deepest fears and desires, their regrets and hopes. They stripped away all pretense and artifice, presenting themselves to each other with brutal honesty. Elizabeth learned of Morgana's origins, of the priestess she had been before her transformation, of the goddess who had cursed her to eternal night as punishment for hubris. She learned of the early centuries, when Morgana had been little more than a monster, killing without thought or remorse. And she learned of the slow, painful journey toward self-awareness, toward the recovery of something like a soul. In turn, Elizabeth shared her own history, her childhood marked by visions and strangeness, her adult isolation and desperate search for belonging. She spoke of the weight of the Manor's guardianship, of the slow erosion of her humanity, of her terror at becoming a monster and her eventual acceptance of that fate. By the time they were ready to perform the ritual, they knew each other more completely than Elizabeth would have thought possible. There were no secrets between them, no hidden corners of the psyche unexplored. They stood before each other naked in every sense, vulnerable and trusting. The ritual took place on the winter solstice, the longest night of the year, when the boundary between worlds was thinnest. They prepared the library as they had before, drawing the circle and lighting the candles. But this time, there was no deception, no hidden agenda. They entered the circle as equals, as partners, as beings who had chosen each other with full knowledge and consent. Morgana began the invocation, her voice resonating with power. The words were in the oldest tongue, the language spoken when the world was young and gods walked among mortals. Elizabeth joined in, adding her voice to Morgana's, and the two sounds wove together in harmonies that reality itself seemed to recognize. The magic built slowly, a tide of power that rose around them. Elizabeth felt Morgana's consciousness approaching hers, felt the ancient vampire's presence like a vast ocean preparing to merge with a river. But this time, there was no resistance, no fear. She opened herself completely, lowering all mental barriers, allowing Morgana full access to her soul. The moment of union was indescribable. Elizabeth felt herself expanding, her consciousness merging with Morgana's, two distinct beings becoming something new and unprecedented. She experienced Morgana's memories as though they were her own, felt the ecstasy of the first kill, the horror of realizing her humanity was slipping away, the terrible loneliness of centuries spent without equal or companion. And Morgana experienced Elizabeth's life in turn, the mortal perspective she had long forgotten, the weight of duty and sacrifice, the fierce love of life even in its brevity and fragility. They spiraled together, two souls dancing in an eternal moment, each enriched by the other, each made greater through union. And when the ritual finally completed, when the magic sealed and the circle faded, they stood as one being inhabiting two bodies. The sensation was disorienting at first. Elizabeth could feel Morgana's thoughts as clearly as her own, could access the ancient vampire's vast knowledge and power as though it had always been hers. And Morgana could perceive through Elizabeth's newer senses, could feel the vitality and passion that still burned in her despite the transformation. They were separate and together simultaneously, a paradox made manifest. They could function independently, pursue separate goals and interests, but they were always aware of each other, always connected at the deepest level. The loneliness that had plagued them both was simply gone, replaced by a communion more profound than any physical or emotional intimacy could provide. In the days and weeks that followed, they learned to navigate their new existence. It required adjustment, learning when to maintain separate identities and when to blur together, finding the balance between independence and unity. But it worked in ways that neither of them had anticipated. They were stronger together, their combined power greater than the sum of its parts. Elizabeth's dedication to protecting humanity complemented Morgana's ancient wisdom and power. Together, they became the perfect guardians of Blackwater Manor, capable of maintaining the seals indefinitely, of responding to any threat that might arise. The prisoners in the crypts fell silent, cowed by the overwhelming presence of the merged consciousness that now watched over them. But they did not limit themselves to mere guardianship. They had time now, centuries stretching before them, and they chose to use it meaningfully. They began to seek out others like themselves, vampires who still retained their humanity, who struggled against the hunger and the slow erosion of their souls. They offered guidance and support, created a network of like-minded immortals dedicated to existing in balance with the mortal world rather than preying upon it. They also hunted those who had lost themselves to madness and bloodlust, those who killed without restraint and threatened to expose the supernatural world to mundane awareness. Elizabeth and Morgana became legends in the night, feared by rogue vampires and respected by those who still honored the old codes. Through it all, their bond remained the foundation of their existence. They had achieved what Morgana had sought for millennia: true companionship, an end to fundamental isolation. And Elizabeth had found something she had never expected, a sense of purpose and belonging that transcended her mortal limitations. Years became decades, and decades became centuries. The world changed around them, technology advancing, civilizations rising and falling, but they remained constant. Guardians of Blackwater Manor, protectors of humanity from horrors it did not know existed. Two beings merged into one without losing their individual essences. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the moon was full and the Atlantic crashed against the cliffs below, they would stand together on the roof of the manor and remember what they had been separately, what they had sacrificed, and what they had become together. They remembered mortality and loneliness, humanity and hunger. They remembered the price they had paid and the gifts they had received. And they knew, with the certainty that came from their merged consciousness, that they had made the right choice. Not an easy choice, not a choice without cost, but the right one nonetheless. Part 4. The Reckoning 3 Centuries, passed like a dream for Elizabeth and Morgana. The merged consciousness that inhabited two bodies had become something unprecedented in the history of vampirism, a synthesis of ancient power and moral clarity, of predatory nature and protective instinct. They had refined their existence into an art form, learning to navigate the complexities of their dual nature with grace and precision. Blackwater Manor remained their stronghold, though they traveled extensively, pursuing knowledge and hunting rogues across the globe. The 13 prisoners in the crypts remained secure, their seals maintained by power far greater than what Lucian had originally employed. No escape attempts troubled Elizabeth's nights anymore. The bound vampires had long since resigned themselves to eternal imprisonment. But eternity has a way of creating unexpected complications. It began with a letter, delivered by an ancient courier service that catered to supernatural entities. The envelope was sealed with wax bearing the symbol Elizabeth had seen only in the oldest texts, a serpent consuming its own tail, within which was inscribed an eye. The sign of the primogenitors, the first vampires, those who had walked the earth before recorded history began. The letter was written in the same archaic tongue Morgana had used during their merging ritual. It summoned them to a gathering, a conclave of the oldest and most powerful vampires in existence, to be held at the site of the first transformation, in a place whose location was given only in metaphor and riddle. Attendance was not optional. The primogenitors had awakened from their long slumber, and they demanded an accounting from their scattered children. Morgana's consciousness, accessed through their bond, was troubled in ways Elizabeth had never felt before. The ancient vampire shared memories that predated even her transformation, racial memories passed down through vampire blood, of a time when the primogenitors had ruled the night openly, when humanity existed primarily as cattle for their sustenance. Those beings were power incarnate, older than civilizations, and if they had truly awakened, their purposes could not be benign. Elizabeth and Morgana debated their response. They could ignore the summons, could fortify Blackwater Manor and prepare for siege. But the primogenitors were not beings one simply defied. If they wanted Elizabeth and Morgana's presence, they would find ways to compel it, and resistance would only ensure their displeasure. Reluctantly, they decided to attend. But they made preparations, weaving protections around themselves and the manor, ensuring that the 13 prisoners would remain secure even in their absence. They contacted their network of allied vampires, warning them that something significant was occurring, that the ancient order might be reasserting itself. The journey to the gathering place took them to the mountains of Tibet, to a valley that appeared on no maps and could only be accessed through paths that defied normal geography. They traveled by night, moving with supernatural speed across continents, following the cryptic directions in the letter. When they finally arrived, they found themselves in a place that existed outside normal reality. The valley was shrouded in perpetual twilight, neither day nor night, lit by a sun that never moved and stars that shone despite its presence. Ancient structures rose from the mountain stone, architecture that predated any civilization Elizabeth had studied, built according to geometries that hurt the mind to contemplate. And everywhere vampires. Hundreds of them, perhaps thousands, gathered from across the world. Elizabeth recognized some from her centuries of work allies and enemies alike, all summoned by the same imperative. But most were strangers, vampires of tremendous age and power, their presence making the air itself feel thick and heavy. At the center of the valley stood a temple carved from a single massive stone, its entrance a mouth opened in a silent scream. Power radiated from it in waves, and Elizabeth knew instinctively that this was where the primogenitors waited. The gathered vampires entered in procession, ordered by age and power. Elizabeth and Morgana, though merged, were relatively young by the standards of this assembly. They filed in among the middle ranks, neither at the forefront nor the rear, and entered the temple. The interior was vast, a cathedral to darkness. The walls were covered in carvings that depicted the history of vampirism, from its earliest origins to the present day. Elizabeth saw scenes of prehistoric hunts, of ancient empires built on blood, of the gradual retreat of vampirikind into shadow as humanity grew stronger and more numerous. At the far end of the temple, seated on thrones of carved bone, were the primogenitors. There were 7 of them, though Elizabeth suspected that 7 was a number chosen for symbolic rather than literal reasons, that these beings could appear as one or as many depending on their will. They were beautiful and terrible in equal measure, their forms perfect and their eyes containing depths that suggested they perceived dimensions invisible to lesser beings. The central figure rose and spoke, its voice resonating not through air, but directly in the minds of all present. It welcomed them, its children and grandchildren many times removed, and explained the reason for the gathering. The primogenitors had slept for millennia, allowing younger vampires to govern themselves and adapt to a changing world. But they had awakened to discover that much had gone wrong, that the race of vampires had devolved from its original purpose. The speaker explained that vampires had been created for a specific reason, designed by forces even older than the primogenitors to serve as a balance to human expansion. Humanity was a species of terrible potential, capable of great creation and equally great destruction. Left unchecked, it would eventually consume the world and reach for the stars, spreading its chaos throughout the cosmos. Vampires were meant to be predators, yes, but also shepherds. They were supposed to cull humanity's numbers, to prevent the species from overwhelming the planet's resources, to maintain the balance between civilization and wilderness. But modern vampires had failed in this duty. They had become too timid, too enamored with human culture, too willing to hide in shadow and feed discreetly rather than openly hunting and killing. The primogenitors had awakened to correct this failure. They were going to reinstate the old order, when vampires ruled openly and humans understood their place in the hierarchy of existence. And every vampire in attendance would be required to participate, to return to their true nature as apex predators, or be destroyed as failures unworthy of immortality. The pronouncement sent shockwaves through the gathered assembly. Many vampires had adapted to modern existence, had built lives within human society, had even come to care for individual humans. The return to open predation would mean the destruction of everything they had created, would trigger a war between humans and vampires that might annihilate both species. But the primogenitors were immovable. They had made their decision, and they possessed the power to enforce it. They demonstrated this by selecting a vampire from the crowd at random, one who dared to voice protest, and reducing it to ash with a gesture. The display of power was absolute and terrifying, leaving no doubt about their capability or willingness to destroy dissenters. Elizabeth felt Morgana's consciousness recoiling in horror. The ancient vampire had seen atrocities across her long existence, had committed her share of them, but this was different. This was a return to an age of darkness that she had thought left behind, a repudiation of all the progress that had been made toward coexistence. Through their bond, Elizabeth and Morgana conferred in the space of a heartbeat. They both knew they could not comply with the primogenitor's command. Everything they had built, all the work they had done to protect humanity while managing their own predatory nature, would be destroyed. And more fundamentally, it would be wrong. Humanity deserved the chance to determine its own fate, not to be culled like animals by beings who claim divine right to rule. But how did you resist gods? How did you stand against beings whose power made even ancient vampires like Morgana seem like children? The answer came from Elizabeth's human heritage, from the mortality she had left behind, but whose lessons remained. You resisted through cunning, through coalition, through finding weaknesses that absolute power inevitably created. Elizabeth stepped forward, drawing the attention of the primogenitors. She spoke respectfully but firmly, requesting permission to address the assembly. The central primogenitor regarded her with something like amusement, no doubt curious what this relatively young vampire could possibly have to say. Open war between vampires and humans would not result in the simple culling the primogenitors envisioned. It would trigger the use of those apocalyptic weapons, would collapse the infrastructure that sustained billions, would potentially render the Earth a barren wasteland unsuitable for either species. The primogenitors would find themselves ruling over ashes, their food source destroyed, their victory meaningless. Furthermore, Elizabeth argued, the current approach was working, albeit slowly. Vampire predation was already limiting human population growth in subtle ways, and many vampires were positioned within human power structures to influence policy toward sustainability. A gradual approach would achieve the primogenitors' goals without the catastrophic destruction that open war would bring. The argument was sophisticated and well-reasoned, drawing on both practical considerations and appeals to the primogenitors' self-interest. Elizabeth could feel the attention of the assembled vampires focusing on her, could sense that many were hoping her words might sway the ancient beings. But the primogenitors were unmoved. They had considered such arguments before making their decision, had concluded that subtlety had failed and force was necessary. They rejected Elizabeth's proposal and reissued their command. All vampires would participate in the new order, or they would be destroyed. And then, to make an example, they reached for Elizabeth and Morgana, intending to demonstrate their power by unmaking the merged consciousness that had dared to argue against them. What happened next would be debated among vampires for generations to come. As the primogenitors' power lashed out, intending to tear Elizabeth and Morgana's merged consciousness apart, it encountered something unexpected. The bond between them, forged through genuine love and absolute trust, proved resistant to the primogenitors' will. It was not mere magical connection, but something deeper, a synthesis that had created its own unique form of existence. The primogenitors' power rebounded, deflected by the integrity of Elizabeth and Morgana's union. For the first time in millennia, these ancient beings encountered something they could not simply unmake with a thought. The failure shocked them, disrupted their absolute certainty. And in that moment of disruption, Elizabeth acted. She and Morgana released their full merged power, not in direct attack against the primogenitors, but as a clarion call to every vampire in the temple. Through the mental connection that all vampires shared to varying degrees, she projected the truth of what the primogenitors intended, stripped of rhetoric and divine authority. She showed them the future that awaited, the war, the destruction, the potential annihilation of both species. And she offered an alternative: unity among modern vampires, a coalition that would resist the primogenitors' command, that would forge a new path forward, combining the best of the old ways with adaptation to new realities. The response was overwhelming. Centuries of frustration, of resentment toward the old order, of desire for self-determination erupted across the assembly. Vampires who had learned to value individual humans, who had built lives and relationships in the modern world, who did not want to return to being mere monsters, they all responded to Elizabeth's call. The temple erupted into chaos. Vampires turned on each other, those loyal to the primogenitors fighting those who rallied to Elizabeth and Morgana's cause. The ancient beings themselves rose from their thrones, their power manifesting in reality-warping displays that turned stone to sand and night to day. But they were outnumbered, and their absolute confidence had been shaken. The coalition that formed around Elizabeth and Morgana fought with desperation and cunning, using modern knowledge of warfare and tactics that the ancient beings did not anticipate. They could not win through superior power, but they could achieve something else. They could force the primogenitors back into slumber, could seal them away through a mass ritual that would require the combined power of hundreds of vampires. The battle raged for hours, destroying much of the temple and reshaping the valley itself. Vampires fell on both sides, reduced to ash by the terrible forces unleashed. Elizabeth and Morgana fought at the center of it all, their merged consciousness allowing them to coordinate the coalition's efforts, to direct power where it was most needed, to maintain the cohesion necessary for the sealing ritual. And slowly, impossibly, they began to succeed. The primogenitors, ancient and powerful as they were, could not overcome the united will of their progeny. They were forced back, their power contained by wards woven from the combined essence of hundreds of vampires. The sealing ritual took form, a working of magic so massive it made the barriers around Blackwater Manor seem like child's play. The primogenitors raged as they felt their consciousness being pulled back into the deep sleep from which they had awakened. They cursed their rebellious children, promised vengeance when they next awoke, swore that this defiance would not go unpunished. But their voices grew weaker, more distant, until finally they faded entirely. When it was done, when the seals were complete and the primogenitors safely confined in a slumber that would hopefully last for millennia, the surviving vampires stood amid the ruins of the temple. More than half the assembly had perished in the battle, their essence scattered to the winds. But those who remained had forged something new, a covenant among modern vampires to resist the old order, to chart their own path forward. Elizabeth and Morgana stood at the center of this new coalition, recognized by all as the catalysts who had made it possible. They had not sought leadership, but it had been thrust upon them nonetheless. The assembled vampires looked to them for guidance, for the vision of how vampirism could exist in the modern world. It was a responsibility even greater than guardianship of Blackwater Manor, and it would consume centuries of their existence. But they accepted it, because the alternative, a return to the Dark Ages when vampires ruled through terror and humanity, existed, only to be preyed upon, was unacceptable. Part 5. The New Order, the aftermath of the rebellion against the primogenitors, reshaped vampire society fundamentally. The old hierarchies based purely on age and power crumbled. In their place arose a new structure, more meritocratic and consensual, built on principles that Elizabeth and Morgana articulated, but that all the survivors helped refine. They called it the Concordat, a binding agreement among vampires to pursue a new approach to existence. It acknowledged their predatory nature, but imposed strict limits on how that nature could be expressed. Killing humans for sustenance was forbidden except in extraordinary circumstances. Instead, vampires would maintain human donors who provided blood willingly, their memories carefully managed to prevent exposure. More radically, the Concordat established rules for creating new vampires. No longer would transformation be a casual act, performed on whim or in passion. Prospective makers would have to present their candidates to regional councils, demonstrate that the human truly understood what they were consenting to, and accept responsibility for their progeny's actions for at least a century. And most importantly, the Concordat created enforcement mechanisms. Vampires who violated the agreement would be hunted by their own kind, judged by councils of their peers, and if found guilty, destroyed or imprisoned. The 13 prisoners beneath Blackwater Manor were not the only such captives. Dozens of similar facilities were established around the world, prisons for those who could not or would not control their darker impulses. Elizabeth and Morgana found themselves at the center of this new world. Their manor became a training ground for young vampires, teaching them control and ethics alongside the traditional skills of hunting and survival. They traveled constantly, mediating disputes between vampire factions, hunting rogues who threatened the Concordat, and slowly, carefully, building bridges between vampire society and certain factions of humanity who could be trusted with the truth. Because that was perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of the New Order, selective disclosure. Not all humans could know about vampires. Mass awareness would still trigger panic and persecution. But certain organizations, certain individuals with the wisdom and influence to help maintain the balance, were brought into the secret. Government officials, religious leaders, even scientists who could study vampirism from a medical perspective while maintaining absolute discretion. This approach created new complications and dangers. There were humans who, upon learning the truth, sought to exploit it for personal gain or who advocated for the complete destruction of all vampires. There were vampires who felt the Concordat gave away too much, who chafed at the restrictions and dreamed of returning to the old ways. Maintaining the balance required constant vigilance and occasional brutal action. But it worked. Decades passed, then a century, and the system held. Vampire-human conflicts, while not eliminated, were dramatically reduced. The exposure risk, while never zero, was managed successfully. And perhaps most importantly, vampires themselves began to change, adapting to the new expectations, finding meaning in existence beyond simple predation. Elizabeth watched these changes with something like wonder. She had been human such a short time ago, relatively speaking, and yet she had helped reshape an entire supernatural species. Through her merged consciousness with Morgana, she had access to memories spanning millennia, but she retained her human perspective, her ability to see vampirism from outside as well as inside. This dual perspective made her invaluable as a leader and mediator. She could understand both human fear of the predator and vampire frustration with restriction. She could empathize with the newly turned struggling with their hunger, while also appreciating the ancient vampire's weariness with existence. She existed between worlds, and that liminal position allowed her to build bridges others could not. But it also took its toll. The weight of responsibility grew heavier with each passing year. Every failure of the Concordat, every human killed by a rogue vampire, every exposure risk that nearly went critical. Elizabeth felt them all personally. The merged consciousness meant that Morgana bore these burdens with her, but that did not make them lighter, only shared. They began to understand what Lucian had felt in his final years, the slow erosion of will that came from carrying such weight for so long. They had advantages Lucian had not. They had each other. They had a community of allies. They had hope that their work was building something lasting. But even advantages had their limits against the grinding pressure of centuries. It was during their 4th century together, as the 21st century gave way to the 22nd, that cracks began to show. Small things at first moments when Elizabeth and Morgana's merged consciousness would disagree with itself. Internal conflicts between their original natures that had never existed before. Elizabeth's human compassion pushing for mercy when Morgana's ancient pragmatism demanded harsh justice. Morgana's weariness seeking rest when Elizabeth's relative youth wanted to continue fighting. These conflicts grew more frequent and more severe. They discovered that merging consciousness did not actually eliminate individual identity, only created the illusion of unity. Deep down, they remained separate beings with separate wills, and the pressures they faced were forcing those differences to the surface. The crisis came suddenly, triggered by a decision about a young vampire named Adrian. He had been turned without proper authorization, his maker having violated the Concordat in a moment of passion. Adrian himself was innocent of this violation, but the question remained, what to do with him? Elizabeth wanted to provide training and integration, to give him a chance despite the irregularity of his creation. Morgana advocated for destruction, both of Adrian and his maker, to send a clear message about the consequences of violating the Concordat. The disagreement might seem minor from the outside, just another policy question to be debated and resolved. But for Elizabeth and Morgana, it became existential. Their merged consciousness could not reconcile these opposed positions, could not find the synthesis that had always emerged before. They felt themselves pulling apart, the bonds that had united them fraying under the strain. In desperation, they retreated to Blackwater Manor, seeking the sanctuary they had always found there. They attempted the merging ritual again, hoping to repair the damage, to reforge the unity that was fragmenting, but the ritual failed. The magic would not take hold, perhaps because they were already merged and the ritual was designed for separate beings, or perhaps because their wills were now too far apart to bridge. For the first time in centuries, Elizabeth and Morgana truly confronted the possibility that their union might not be eternal. The bond they had created, which had seemed unbreakable, was failing under pressures neither of them had anticipated. And the implications of separation were staggering, not just the personal loss, though that would be devastating, but the political consequences for the Concordat and the entire vampire society they had built. They spent weeks in isolation, trying every method they could conceive to repair the bond. They attempted variations of the merging ritual, consulted ancient texts, even reached out to other merged beings they had encountered over the centuries. But nothing worked. The consciousness that had been one was becoming two again, and no force they could marshal seemed capable of stopping it. It was Morgana who finally faced the truth they had both been avoiding. She explained, with the weariness of millennia in her voice, that perhaps this was inevitable. They had merged out of loneliness and need, had created something beautiful and powerful, but they had not accounted for the fact that growth might eventually push them apart. Elizabeth had continued to develop, her personality shaped by experiences and challenges that Morgana could observe but not fully share. And Morgana herself had changed through Elizabeth's influence, softening in ways that conflicted with the harder edges of her original nature. They were no longer the beings who had performed the merging ritual, and perhaps it was time to acknowledge that, to separate gracefully while they still could, before the dissolution became violent and destructive. Elizabeth resisted this conclusion with everything in her. The thought of losing the constant presence of Morgana in her consciousness, of returning to solitary existence even as a vampire, was unbearable. But she also recognized the wisdom in Morgana's words. They could feel the bond deteriorating, could sense that forcing it to hold would eventually damage both of them irreparably. And so, with heavy hearts and in full awareness of what they were losing, they performed the dissolution ritual. It was the opposite of the merging, a careful unweaving of the bonds that had tied their consciousness together. The process took days and was emotionally agonizing, like tearing out pieces of their own souls. When it was done, Elizabeth and Morgana stood separate once more. They could still communicate, could still work together, but the intimate connection was gone. Each was alone in her own mind, experiencing existence as an individual rather than as part of a greater whole. The loneliness was crushing. Elizabeth had forgotten what it felt like to be truly alone, to have thoughts that no one else immediately shared, to feel emotions without Morgana's presence to temper and contextualize them. She wandered Blackwater Manor like a ghost, touching objects that had been witness to their union, feeling the weight of the separation like a physical pain. Morgana handled it differently, retreating into the ancient stoicism that had sustained her through millennia before Elizabeth existed. She threw herself into work, coordinating Concordat business with mechanical efficiency, her emotions locked behind walls that Elizabeth could no longer bypass. They tried to maintain their partnership, to continue leading the vampire community together. But the separation had changed their dynamic fundamentally. Decisions that had once flowed easily from their merged consciousness now required negotiation and compromise. They disagreed more frequently, sometimes publicly, undermining the authority they had built. The vampire community began to fracture in response. Factions formed around Elizabeth and Morgana, each representing different philosophies about how the Concordat should evolve. What had been a unified movement began to split into competing camps, and the specter of civil war loomed. It was in this moment of crisis that the unexpected happened. Adrian, the young vampire whose case had triggered the dissolution, came to Blackwater Manor seeking audience with Elizabeth and Morgana. He had heard of their separation, understood that he had been the catalyst, and wanted to offer himself as a sacrifice to restore unity. His offer was noble, but ultimately futile blood sacrifice would not repair what had broken between Elizabeth and Morgana. But his presence, his willingness to die to heal a rift he had not intentionally created, catalyzed something in both ancient vampires. They realized they had been approaching the problem incorrectly. They had been trying to restore what was lost, to recreate a past state of being, when they should have been looking forward, finding a new way to relate to each other and to their community. The merging had served its purpose, had gotten them through centuries when they needed that level of unity. But now they faced different challenges that required different solutions. They did not need to be one being with a single will. They needed to be partners with complementary strengths, able to disagree and debate while still working toward common goals. This realization did not make the loneliness disappear, did not erase the pain of separation, but it provided a framework for moving forward. They publicly acknowledged their dissolution, explained that they would continue to lead together despite being separate consciousness, and demonstrated through Adrian's case how this could work. Elizabeth advocating for mercy and integration, Morgana for strict justice, and together finding a middle path that satisfied both principles. The vampire community, seeing that their leaders could disagree without destroying each other or the Concordat, began to calm. The factional tensions eased, though they did not disappear entirely. A new maturity entered vampire politics, an acceptance that unity did not require uniformity, that disagreement was not betrayal. Elizabeth and Morgana settled into a new relationship, one of profound friendship and partnership without the merged consciousness. They maintained separate quarters in Blackwater Manor, came together for work and occasionally for companionship, but respected each other's autonomy and privacy. It was not what they had once shared, but it was genuine and sustainable in ways the merging had ultimately not been. And slowly, painfully, Elizabeth made peace with her solitude. She was alone in her mind again, yes, but she was not isolated. She had Morgana as a friend and ally, had the vampire community they had built together, had purpose and meaning in her work. The loneliness remained, a constant ache she suspected would never fully heal, but she learned to live with it, to accept it as part of her nature. Part 6. The eternal vigil centuries continued their march, and Elizabeth grew into her ancient status. She was no longer the young vampire struggling with transformation, nor the merged consciousness that had reshaped vampire society. She was simply herself, Elizabeth Ashford, guardian of Blackwater Manor, architect of the Concordat,